My name is Michael Harper. I was 44 years old, living in Austin, Texas, and I worked as a civil engineer. You'd think someone with my background would be the last person to get caught in a neighborhood war over property lines. But the truth is, everything I thought I knew about boundaries, both in land and in friendship, was shattered the day my best friend turned into my worst enemy. For nearly 15 years, my next-door neighbor, Daniel Brooks, and I had been inseparable. Our families were joined at the hip backyard barbecues, holidays spent together, our kids running between our houses as if there were no fences at all. We used to laugh about how our friendship was the strongest foundation on the street, but foundations crack. And in our case, the crack appeared in the form of a simple cinder block wall. It started when Daniel announced he was rebuilding the boundary wall between our properties. He claimed the original had shifted over time, and according to his updated survey, part of the land I'd been maintaining for years, my rose garden, my tool shed, was actually his. He said it with a smirk, like it was already decided. I thought it was a misunderstanding. I offered to check the city records together, but Daniel shook his head and said 5 words that froze me. The HOA already approved it. Our homeowners association had a reputation for being strict, but I never imagined they would meddle in a personal property line dispute. Yet, within days, I received an official-looking notice on HOA letterhead stating that my encroachments needed to be removed immediately, or I would face daily fines. They didn't ask for my side. They didn't investigate. They simply took Daniel's word as gospel. My hands shook as I read the paper, not just from anger, but from betrayal. Daniel wasn't just my neighbor, he was the godfather to my son. And now, he was threatening me with the very HOA that was supposed to serve all of us equally. At first, I tried reason. I went to Daniel's house that evening, the notice still in my hand. This doesn't make sense. I told him. We both know that wall has stood in the same place for decades. Let's go down to City Hall together and look at the original plat map. But Daniel's face hardened. He leaned against his doorway, crossed his arms, and said, "Mike, don't make this harder than it needs to be. The HOA is on my side. If you fight this, you'll lose everything. Do yourself a favor and move the fence." That's when I realized this wasn't about misunderstanding. This was about power. Over the next week, the HOA escalated. They sent me a second notice: remove the shed within 10 days or face fines of $500 a week. Neighbors began whispering, some avoiding eye contact altogether. I caught sight of Daniel holding court at a block gathering, gesturing toward my property as people nodded along. It was as if he was rewriting the history of our friendship right in front of everyone. Then came the night that changed everything. I was sitting in my backyard, staring at that wall, when my wife, Laura, came out carrying an old photo album. She flipped it open to a picture from 12 years ago. Daniel, his wife, Laura, and me, standing arm in arm in front of that very wall, a barbecue grill smoking in the background. Behind us, clear as day, was the rose garden and the shed unquestionably on my side of the wall. Laura whispered, "Why would he lie when he knows the truth?" I didn't have an answer, but in that moment, I knew something bigger was at play. It wasn't just Daniel's word against mine. Someone had rewritten the map. The next morning, another letter arrived. This one was more aggressive. Failure to comply will result in legal action, including potential foreclosure proceedings. Foreclosure. Over a shed and a rose garden. I stared at the page until the words blurred. Somewhere deep in my memory, I recalled an old county record office downtown, dusty and forgotten, where original plats and surveys from decades past were stored. If Daniel had a new survey, then I had to find the old one. Because if there was a fake map, I was going to expose it. I had always believed that once neighbors crossed a line, there was still room for forgiveness. But Daniel wasn't just crossing lines. He was moving them entirely, Only 3 days after the second HOA notice, I woke up to the sound of drilling. When I stepped into the backyard, my heart sank. Daniel had hired a crew, and they were fencing off the narrow pathway behind our houses, a path that had always been shared by both families to access the back alley. My kids used it to ride their bikes. Delivery men used it when they couldn't fit their trucks on the main street. It was as essential to our homes as the front doors. But Daniel stood there, supervising like a general at war. When I confronted him, he waved a folded HOA letter in my face. The board ruled this pathway falls under my property. I'm just protecting what's mine, protecting he was stealing. Plain and simple. That night, I attended the HOA's special session. I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd have a chance to argue. Instead, I found myself ambushed. Daniel had already presented his updated survey, and the board members, people I'd served with on landscaping committees, people who once borrowed sugar from me, sat stone-faced, treating me like a criminal trespasser. They lectured me on respecting property boundaries, while ignoring the fact that those boundaries had stood uncontested for decades. One board member, a woman named Vanessa, even dared to say, "If you don't comply, Mr. Harper, the fines will escalate. It's your responsibility to correct your mistakes." Mistakes. That word rang in my ears as I sat silently, fists clenched under the table. Daniel smirked at me across the room, leaning back like a king watching his pawn do the dirty work. When I got home, Laura tried to calm me down. "They're bluffing," she said, but even her voice trembled. My children overheard us, their faces pale. It struck me then this wasn't just a fight about land. This was about dignity, about whether our family would be forced to live under Daniel's shadow, branded as liars in our own neighborhood. The following weekend, we were invited to a casual neighborhood cookout. Normally, I would have skipped it, but I needed to see how far Daniel's influence had spread. Sure enough, he was there, laughing loudly, telling anyone who would listen that I had encroached on his land for years. I noticed people's eyes flicker toward me, some sympathetic, others judgmental. Laura squeezed my hand and whispered, "Don't give him the satisfaction." But my blood boiled when Daniel, beer in hand, clapped a neighbor on the shoulder and said, "Some folks just don't know when to admit they're wrong." I wanted to shout, I wanted to expose him right there, but without proof. All I had were my words against his, and the HOA had already shown whose words they valued. Later that evening, when the crowd thinned and the embers of the grill died down, Laura disappeared into the house and came back carrying the same old photo album from the night before. She had kept flipping through the pages, searching for something more, and she found it. She handed me a glossy print, dated 15 years earlier. It showed Daniel and me, shoulder to shoulder, hammering nails into a wooden trellis we'd built for my rose garden. Behind us, clear as day, was the original boundary wall. The shed, the roses, the pathway, everything Daniel now claimed as his was undeniably on my property. I studied the photo until my eyes burned. Here was proof that the story Daniel told was a lie. And yet, photos could be dismissed as sentimental memories. I needed something stronger, something official. That night, I sat at my desk and stared at the HOA letters piled in front of me. The word foreclosure glared back like a death sentence. My mind went back to what I knew as an engineer. Structures don't move on their own. Boundaries don't magically shift. If Daniel had a new survey, then someone had drawn it that way. And if someone drew it, that meant it could be a forgery. I slammed the photo album shut and whispered to myself, "If Daniel is waving a new map, then I'll dig up the old one. And when I do, his entire story will collapse." I had thought the HOA notices couldn't get worse. I was wrong. On Monday morning, as I poured coffee in the kitchen, Laura rushed in holding a thick envelope. "Another letter," she said, her face pale. I tore it open and read aloud, "Failure to comply within 5 days will result in the initiation of foreclosure proceedings. Additional fines totaling $7,500 are now pending. $7,500. Over a wall, over a pathway, over lies. Laura sat down hard at the table, her hands trembling. Mike, we can't pay that. Not with tuition, not with the mortgage. I felt the blood drain from my face. They weren't just threatening us anymore. They were preparing to destroy us financially. And the cruelest part, Daniel had engineered every step. Later that day, as I drove into the neighborhood, I saw Daniel standing in his driveway, casually watering his lawn while neighbors gathered around him. I slowed the car, listening through the open window. He was spinning his story again, that I had been freeloading on his land, that I refused to admit my mistake. He spoke with such confidence that I saw doubt flicker even in the eyes of people who had known me for years. When he noticed me, Daniel raised his hand in a mock wave, his smirk unmistakable. He didn't need to shout. His smile told me everything I've already won. That evening, I gathered my kids in the living room. I had to explain why our neighbors were whispering, why some of their friends weren't allowed over anymore. My son asked, "Dad, are we really in trouble with the law? Are we going to lose the house?" The question nearly broke me. I swallowed hard and said, "No, we're going to fight this, because the truth is on our side." But even as I said the words, I felt the crushing weight of doubt. Truth meant nothing without proof. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the house sounded like an omen. I imagined deputies showing up, nailing foreclosure signs to the door. My children packing boxes while Daniel watched with satisfaction from across the yard. At dawn, I returned to the backyard. I walked along the wall, tracing the lines with my hand, trying to remember every project, every improvement I had made with Daniel back when we were friends. It felt surreal, as if I had stumbled into a nightmare where memories no longer matched reality. But then my eyes landed on the shed. The same shed Daniel now claimed was his. I remembered building its foundation myself, leveling the ground, pouring the concrete. I remembered Daniel helping me carry the lumber, laughing about how crooked our cuts were. The past was solid. The present was false, which meant the truth had to be buried somewhere. Laura came out, wrapped in her robe, holding a mug of coffee. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. "I'm thinking about the county records office downtown," I said. "The old plats. The original surveys, they'll still be there. They have to be. If Daniel's waving around a new survey, then someone manufactured it. And if I can prove that..." Her eyes searched mine. "You think he forged a map?" I nodded slowly. Or had someone forge it for him. Either way, if I can find the old documents, it'll blow his story apart. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of resolve. The HOA could bully me, Daniel could smear me, but paper doesn't lie, not the old kind, written in ink and stamped by the county clerk. As I turned back toward the house, I noticed a few neighbors peeking from their windows, quickly pulling the blinds when I caught them. It didn't matter. Let them watch. Let them whisper. They could believe Daniel for now. Because when I walked into that dusty office and pulled the real plat map from its drawer, the truth would be undeniable. I whispered to myself. Tomorrow, I go digging, and for the first time, I wasn't talking about soil, I was talking about secrets. I was at the Travis County Records office when the doors unlocked at 9. The place smelled like dust and toner, a quiet cathedral of drawers and microfilm where arguments like mine were settled by ink, not by rumor. I signed the request sheet with a tight hand and asked for the original plat for our subdivision. Cedar Ridge, Section 2, plus any amendments, lot line adjustments, and easement vacations tied to my lot and Daniel's. The clerk, a woman with silver hair and a name tag that read Irene, raised an eyebrow when she saw the list. "That's a lot of paper for a Monday?" "It's a lot of lies for a weekend," I said, and tried to smile. She wheeled out a cart stacked with binders and rolled the microfilm reader to an empty table. I had studied thousands of plans in my career, but my stomach still knotted when the first plat slid into view. There it was, the subdivision grid, our two lots side by side, and a bold note along the rear property line's utility and drainage easement. 6 wide, exactly where Daniel had fenced off the shared pathway. I snapped a photo and wrote down the record number. If an easement existed along that strip, he couldn't legally claim it as private without a city-approved vacation. And easements didn't vanish because a neighbor felt entitled. Irene returned with a thin folder. "You also asked for lot line adjustments," she said. "Only one hit 8 years ago." Denied. I took the folder like a lifeline. Inside was a single-page notice. An application to adjust the boundary between our two lots had been submitted and rejected for insufficient owner consent. The applicant's signature line was inked by someone I didn't recognize, and the owner consent line for my side was blank. Denied. The date and stamp were clear. "Is there a filed vacation of that rear easement?" I asked. Irene shook her head. "Not in our system. For city easements, you'd also need a council resolution. Those are public. If it happened, you'd see it." I swallowed. "And anything newer, corrective deeds, amended plats." She hesitated, then slid over another document sleeve. "This came in 2 months ago. A corrective affidavit referencing your block and lot numbers. No survey attached." I eased the paper out. The language was intentionally foggy, clarifying historical boundary intent, and it was notarized by a name I didn't know. My skin prickled when I read the filer, Brookline Property Services, LLC. I didn't know the company, but the root of the name Brook echoed inside my skull like a warning bell. Brooks, Daniel's last name. I photocopied everything and asked for certified copies of the original plat and the easement page. As the printer hummed, a man about my age shuffled up behind me, holding his own folder of deeds. "You from Cedar Ridge?" he asked under his breath. I heard someone fenced the alley. I turned. They did, and the HOA blessed it. He grimaced. "My sister lives 2 streets over. Their board tried to relocate a drainage swale right into her garden. Told her it was always that way until she pulled the 1996 plat and shoved it in their faces." He tapped my stack. Paper wins. Eventually. The word felt heavier than it should have. By the time I left the building, my phone was buzzing with texts, neighbors trading updates like weather alerts. "He's cutting the tree. City said it's private. Fence crew is back." I turned onto our street and saw the crowd before I saw the stump. Daniel had hired a crew to fell the old live oak at our rear corner, the one whose roots held the slope in place. It had straddled the easement line like a sentinel for 40 years. Now it lay in sections on the lawn, sap bleeding from the cuts. "You can't do that," I said, striding up. "There's a recorded utility and drainage easement through here." Daniel didn't look at me at first. He was talking to Vanessa from the HOA board, both of them nodding as if reading the same script. Then he turned, calm as a surgeon. "Mike, you're out of your depth." The board determined the pathway and that tree were on my side. "Safety hazard. You should thank me." Neighbors hovered, some filming, some pretending not to while the crew hauled away limbs. Water pooled along the fence where the ground had been torn up, a dirty mirror catching the sun. Laura appeared at my side and gripped my arm hard enough to leave marks. "Where did you get the authority?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. Vanessa stepped forward. "The board issued a maintenance directive based on the updated survey Mr. Brooks provided. If you have concerns, submit them in writing." "I have more than concerns," I said, lifting the folder. "I have the original plat and a denied lot line adjustment, and no recorded vacation for that easement." For the first time, something flickered across Daniel's face. Annoyance. Maybe, or surprise. It vanished as quickly as it came. He leaned in just enough that only I could hear. "You're going to embarrass yourself." I didn't answer. I was afraid if I opened my mouth, Anger would pour out and drown both of us. That evening, a few neighbors drifted to our porch with casseroles and hesitant apologies. Mariah, from 2 doors down, spoke for the group. "People are confused," she said. "The board keeps saying updated records. But if there's an easement, fencing, it makes flooding worse. My yard is already soggy." I showed them the certified plat. Watching their faces change confusion to understanding, to anger steadied my breathing. "Tomorrow," I said. "I'll take these to the city engineer's office and log a formal complaint. If the HOA ignored a recorded easement, they overstepped." After they left, the house settled into a wary quiet. Laura put the kids to bed. I laid the documents out on the dining table like a puzzle I already knew the answer to. Denied adjustment, unvacated easement, a corrective affidavit filed by a company whose name felt like a taunt. I locked up for the night, flipped off the porch light, and pulled open the mailbox to clear the junk before bed. An envelope was jammed halfway inside, no stamp, no return address. I slid it free, and my thumb smeared a line through the thick black ink of 3-block letters scrawled across the front. "Stop digging now." I stood in the dark with the warning in my hand, the silence of the street pressing in, and realized someone wasn't just moving lines on paper anymore. They were drawing a new one around me. The HOA meeting was called for 7 o'clock sharp on a Wednesday evening, but by the time I arrived, the clubhouse parking lot was already full. The crowd spilling onto the lawn told me this wasn't just another committee discussion, it was a spectacle, and I was the main event. Inside, the room buzzed with conversations that quieted only when I stepped through the door. Eyes turned toward me, not with warmth, but with the kind of sharp curiosity reserved for criminals. At the head of the room sat Vanessa, the board member who had sided so eagerly with Daniel, and standing beside her, smug and composed, was Daniel himself, a rolled-up survey, clutched like a scepter. Vanessa tapped the microphone. "Thank you all for attending. Tonight we will address an ongoing violation involving Lot 27 owned by Mr. Michael Harper." Her gaze swept over the crowd before landing on me. "We want transparency, so that everyone here understands the issue." Daniel stepped forward, as though he were the host of the evening. He unfurled the survey dramatically across the table, the bold lines and stamped seal catching the overhead light. "As you can all see," he said, his voice smooth, "the boundary clearly shows that Mr. Harper's shed and garden encroach several feet into my property. The HOA has confirmed these findings. I regret that our friendship has come to this, but the rules must be respected." A murmur rippled through the audience. I could hear snippets, didn't know he was like that. How long has he been freeloading? The HOA wouldn't lie. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to speak. "That survey is a forgery. The original plat, certified by the county, shows a 6-foot easement and a denied lot line adjustment. Nothing has changed since the day this neighborhood was built. Daniel is rewriting history, and the board is letting him—" Vanessa interjected quickly, her voice clipped. "Mr. Harper, accusations like that require evidence. Do you have any? I raised the folder I'd carried in. Certified copies, stamped and dated. Anyone here can review them." For a moment, silence. Then Daniel laughed, a sharp sound that cut the air. "Old documents, old mistakes. The updated survey reflects reality. Technology improves, boundaries shift, and sometimes people cling to the past because it benefits them." He glanced at the audience knowingly. "You've all seen how water runs through that alley. Maybe the easement never should have been there." The crowd chuckled nervously, nodding as if his logic made sense. My throat burned. It didn't matter that I was right. Perception was stronger than truth when one man held the microphone. The board voted that evening to continue enforcement. Fines would remain. Foreclosure remained on the table. I left the clubhouse to the sound of neighbors whispering, Daniel shaking hands as if he'd just won an election. Outside, The night air was thick and heavy. I walked alone toward my truck when a voice rasped behind me. "Mr. Harper?" I turned. At the edge of the parking lot, leaning against a lamppost, stood an older man I barely recognized. His hair was white, his posture stooped, but his eyes were alert, almost defiant. He glanced around, then shuffled forward and pressed a thick envelope into my hand. "You don't know me," he whispered. "Name's Walter. I've lived here longer than anyone else. I saw what really happened years ago. They think everyone's forgotten, but I haven't." I stared down at the envelope. "What is this proof?" he said simply. "Keep it close. Don't trust the board. Don't trust anyone. When the time's right, use it." Before I could ask more, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, moving quicker than I thought a man his age could. Back in my truck, I held the envelope like it was a live wire. My hands shook as I tore it open. Inside were yellowed pages, photocopies of meeting minutes from the HOA board dated nearly 25 years earlier, and scrawled across the margins, in thick black pen, were notes boundary adjusted without consent. President Brooks pushed it through. Map altered residents never notified. President Brooks. My stomach lurched. Daniel's father. I gripped the wheel, the envelope trembling in my hands. This wasn't just Daniel's scheme. It was a legacy of fraud stretching back decades. And if these notes were real, the rot ran through the very foundation of our neighborhood. I didn't sleep that night. The envelope sat on the kitchen table, its edges curled and yellow, whispering secrets every time I glanced at it. Laura urged me to rest. But how could I? Those minutes, if authentic, proved that the Brooks family had been manipulating boundaries for decades. Daniel wasn't just repeating history, he was continuing an inheritance of deceit. By dawn, I had read the pages at least a dozen times. The handwriting in the margins was frantic but clear, boundary adjusted without consent. President Brooks forced the vote. Maps altered. It matched the year Daniel's father had served as HOA president. And though the notes weren't signed, I couldn't shake the feeling that Walter, the old man who'd handed them to me, had been in that room all those years ago. At breakfast, Laura's eyes were heavy. "Mike, if this is true, you can't just wave it around like a flag. The board will call it hearsay." "I know," I said. "But combined with the county records, it shows a pattern. First, the denied adjustment. Now proof they tried to force one through behind closed doors. It means this new survey isn't just wrong. It's the latest in a chain of fraud." She reached for my hand. "Just be careful. Daniel won't stop. If his father did this, imagine what he's willing to do to protect the family name." Her words followed me all day. And she was right. Because by afternoon, retaliation arrived. A code violation notice from the city tacked to my front door, citing improper drainage maintenance. My yard had never flooded until Daniel's crew ripped out the oak and blocked the easement. Now, suddenly, the city was involved. I called the number on the notice, and the inspector on the line admitted offhandedly. Complaint came through the HOA. Of course it had. I drove to Walter's address that evening, determined to confront him. His small brick house sat at the far end of the subdivision, its lawn overgrown, blinds drawn. When he finally cracked the door, chain still hooked, his eyes darted around nervously. "You shouldn't have come here," he muttered. "I need to know if these notes are yours," I said, holding up the envelope. His jaw tightened. "I was secretary back then. I kept copies when I realized what Brooks was doing. Everyone else looked away. He was too powerful, too connected. If I'd spoken up, they'd have buried me in lawsuits." "Then why now?" I asked. Walter's gaze hardened. "Because his son is doing the same thing to you. I won't watch another family get steamrolled. But be warned, Harper, once you use those notes, there's no going back. Daniel will come after you with everything. I thanked him and left, the weight of his warning pressing against my chest. The sun dipped behind the rooftops, shadows stretching across the street like grasping hands. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a group of neighbors gathered at Daniel's lawn. He was holding court again, waving papers in the air. I caught fragments: official survey, court precedent, illegal shed. His audience nodded like loyal subjects as I carried the envelope inside. One neighbor, Mariah, broke away and hurried to me. "Mike, is it true," she asked quietly, "that the board could take your house?" "They're trying," I said. Her expression faltered. "People are scared. If Daniel can do this to you, what's stopping him from doing it to any of us?" That was the moment it hit me. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was everyone's. If Daniel succeeded, the HOA could redraw any line, claim any property, and ruin anyone who resisted. I gathered Laura and the kids after dinner and laid everything out: the county plats, the denied adjustment, Walter's notes. My daughter, barely 12, looked at me with wide eyes. "So Mr. Brooks's dad cheated first, and now he's cheating too." "Yes," I said quietly. "And unless we stop them, they'll keep cheating until no one here owns what they think they do." Silence filled the room. Even the ticking clock seemed to pause. Laura spoke first. "Then you need help. You can't do this alone." She was right. And that night, I made a decision: I would reach out to the neighbors who'd already expressed doubt, the ones whose yards had flooded since the oak came down, the ones who'd whispered their frustrations but kept their heads down. Together, we could be stronger than Daniel and his false maps. I typed out a dozen messages before midnight, asking for a private meeting at my house the following weekend. As I hit send, a car slowed in front of our house. Headlights lingered on the windows. I froze, watching the silhouette of a driver staring back at me before speeding away. A chill crawled up my spine. Daniel knew I was fighting back, and now he was watching. By morning, I had a plan stacked truth on paper taller than Daniel's lies. I started at the city engineer's counter, where a young tech named Priya pulled up our subdivision on a stormwater map. Blue lines traced the drainage easement behind our lots like veins. "That strip should never be fenced," she said, pointing. "Water needs that path. If someone blocked it, flow backs into adjacent yards." "It's blocked," I said, "and the HOA blessed it." She winced. "File a drainage obstruction complaint. We'll inspect. If the easement exists on the recorded plat, the fence has to come down or be modified." I handed over certified copies of the original plat and easement page. She stamped my complaint with the quiet finality of a gavel. Small, but real. Next stop was the county clerk's research room, different building. Same smell of dust and old toner. Irene, the silver-haired clerk who'd helped me before, nodded as soon as she saw me. Back for more chain of title on both lots. Deeds, addenda, anything that touched the rear line. And any re-recordings in the last year. She rolled out a new cart and set up the microfilm reader. As the first reel flickered to life, I felt that familiar not engineer's certainty colliding with neighbor's dread. The oldest deed was clean. Meets and bounds matched the subdivision plat. Then came a 2000-era deed of trust ordinary. But the next frame made me sit forward. Exhibit C boundary clarification, rear fence. The language was slippery, clarifying the historical intent of the rear boundary. No survey attached. No signatures from my lot's owner at the time. Whoever drafted it had used words as levers. I scanned back one frame. No Exhibit C in the prior recording. Forward again, there it was, attached and indexed. The footer line read, "Re-recorded to correct Scrivener's error, stamped 2 months ago." 2 months. The same window when Brookline Property Services LLC filed that corrective affidavit. I copied the header and the notary block. The notary seal was crisp, the signature looping and familiar. V. Cole, Notary Public, Travis County. Vanessa's last name was Cole. My pulse ticked in my throat. Conflict of interest wasn't just a smell anymore. It had a stamp. Irene leaned over my shoulder. You see, that re-recording footer means someone brought it back in recently. Clerical corrections are normal for typos, but substantive boundary changes aren't scrivener's errors. Those need consents. Whose name filed the re-recording, I asked. She paged through the jacket. Submitted by Brookline Property Services. Her finger tapped a contact line. Registered agent Emily Brooks, Daniel's wife. I took a breath that felt like glass. Do you have the survey behind this Exhibit C not in our packet? Irene said. If it exists, it would be at the surveyor of record or the title company. But look, this index flags a survey number. She scribbled it on a post-it. Call the licensing board if you can't track the firm. Back in my truck, I dialed the survey office listed on the post-it. The number rang into a generic voicemail. I tried the state licensing board next. A recorded menu, then a registrar who sounded both tired and precise. Surveyor license 42719, I asked. One moment. Keys clacked. Expired last year. Non-renewal. We show prior employment at Brookline Property Services. I stared through the windshield at our street, at the fence that had become a fortress. So the updated survey filed to move my line was stamped by an expired license tied to the Brooks Company. I can't opine on filings, the registrar said carefully, but I can confirm the status. She paused. If someone practiced surveying without an active license, that's a complaint you can file. I thanked her and hung up. My hand shook. Laura texted inspector, left a door hanger. Drainage inspection tomorrow. Mariah says her yard flooded again. I drove home with a folder that felt heavier by the mile. Daniel stood in his driveway when I pulled in, pretending not to watch me unload. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a glance. Inside, Laura spread the new copies across the dining table. Vanessa notarized the corrective affidavit, she whispered. And Emily's the registered agent for Brookline, I said. The same LLC that pushed the re-recording. The surveyor tied to Brookline. License expired. Laura's eyes hardened. They built the perfect circle. Board, notary, company, survey, all under their roof, until paper tears the roof off, I said, but it came out thinner than I intended. That night, when the kids were asleep, I went back to the microfilm scans on my laptop. I placed 2 frames side by side, the older deed image without Exhibit C and the re-recorded packet with it attached. I zoomed into the bottom margin, the part most people never read. There, tiny text prepared by followed by a name. On the older image, the line was fully visible. Prepared by Thomas R. Brooks, President. Cedar Ridge, HOA, 2000. On the re-recorded image, the version attached 2 months ago, the bottom eighth of the page was cropped black. The preparer line was gone. I scrolled through the packet. The notary page remained. The Brookline submitter remained. The easement map still missing. But the single line that tied the original clarification to Daniel's father had been quietly erased in the modern scan. My breath caught. It wasn't just a forged narrative. It was an edited history. I printed both images and held them to the lamp. Edges aligned. One page named Thomas Brooks. The other had amputated him. The difference was the kind of mistake only someone scared of fingerprints would make, and it changed everything. I confronted Daniel the next evening. He was in his driveway again, shirt sleeves rolled up, hose in hand as though watering his grass were an act of dominance. The papers burned inside my folder. I crossed the street and dropped them onto the hood of his truck. "Recognize this?" I asked. He gave a theatrical sigh, set the hose aside, and glanced down. His eyes skimmed the documents, the original plat with the easement marked clear, the denied lot adjustment, and finally the 2 versions of Exhibit C. For a heartbeat, something flickered in his expression. Then he smirked. "You've been busy," he said. Your father filed the original clarification 20 years ago. I pressed. And now, suddenly, it's been re-recorded cropped to remove his name. You and Emily submitted it through Brookline, and Vanessa notarized the affidavit. It's all one long circle of fraud. Daniel leaned closer until I could smell his cologne. Do you think anyone cares? Mike. The board listens to me. The neighbors believe me. You show up waving old paperwork. They'll say you're desperate. I jabbed a finger at the copies. The surveyor who stamped your so-called update, his license expired. Practicing without one is a state offense. I've already confirmed it. That wiped the smile from his face, but only for a second. Then he laughed, low and sharp. Go ahead. File your complaints. By the time the state responds, you'll be bankrupt from fines and foreclosure. That clock is ticking. My pulse thundered. You built this house of lies on my family's back. But it's collapsing. Daniel, everyone will see it soon. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper only I could hear. Careful. Mike, you've got kids, a wife. You really want to drag them through a war you can't win for the first time. Real fear surged beneath my anger. His threat wasn't vague anymore, it was personal. That night, retaliation came swift. Laura found our garbage cans overturned in the street, trash strewn across the lawn. The next morning, a letter arrived from the HOA citing yard neglect and threatening yet another fine. Someone had lodged an anonymous noise complaint, too, even though our house had been silent. It was all coordinated, and I knew whose fingerprints were on it. Still, I refused to bend. I spent hours organizing the evidence into binders, certified plats, the denied adjustment, Walter's minutes, the cropped Exhibit C, the notary block with Vanessa's seal, the expired surveyor's license, piece by piece. The puzzle formed a picture too damning to ignore. Late that night, I sat at the dining table, pages spread before me, when Laura placed a hand on my shoulder. Do you ever wonder, she asked softly, if Daniel was ever really your friend, or if it was always about this? The question cut deeper than I expected. Memories surged, our kids' birthdays celebrated together, beers shared after long work days, the trust we'd built like a second family. Had it all been camouflage for a plot laid decades earlier? Had I been the fool in a game they'd already decided? I looked at the cropped deed again, the black bar erasing Thomas Brooks's name, and I knew the answer. This wasn't new. It was inherited greed. Daniel was only continuing the theft his father had begun. The house was quiet, but my thoughts screamed. Every shred of evidence proved a system stacked against me. HOA, surveys. Even neighbors cowed into silence. But in that silence, I also heard resolve. I wasn't just fighting for my garden or my shed. I was fighting for the truth that families like Daniel's had buried beneath paper and signatures. And if he thought fear would stop me, he underestimated just how dangerous a man with nothing left to lose could be. The next morning, as I stepped onto the porch, I found a single brick lying on the welcome mat. No note, no markings, just the weight of a silent warning. And I knew Daniel's threats were no longer just words. The brick sat on my porch like a verdict. I carried it inside, set it on the dining table beside my binders of evidence, and stared at it until Laura whispered, Mike, what if he's escalating? I had no answer. Fear gnawed at me, but so did fury. Daniel wanted me to back down, to feel powerless. Instead, the brick hardened my resolve. That weekend, a handful of neighbors answered my invitation and crowded into our living room. Mariah came first, clutching photos of her flooded backyard. Then James and Lila from down the street, both muttering about mysterious fines they'd started receiving. Finally, Walter arrived, slow but steady, a man carrying decades of silence he was finally ready to break. I laid everything out on the coffee table, the plats, the denied adjustment, Walter's minutes, the re-recorded Exhibit C, the notary seal, the expired surveyor's license. The neighbors leaned in, whispering disbelief. James rubbed his jaw. So you're saying the Brooks family's been shifting lines for years, and the HOA covered it up? I'm saying they built an empire of lies. I replied, Daniel's father started it. Daniel and Emily are continuing it, and Vanessa notarized their cover story. If we don't stop this now, they'll redraw the map until no one knows what they own anymore. Walter cleared his throat, his voice rough. He's right. I saw it with my own eyes. Thomas Brooks pushed that adjustment through in a backroom meeting. I kept those notes because I knew someday the truth would matter. Mariah's hands trembled as she spread her photos across the pile. Since they fenced that easement, my basement's been wet. If there's a recorded drainage strip, they can't take it. That fence is illegal. I nodded. The city inspector's coming this week. If he files a violation, that's one strike. But we need more. We need to show this isn't a single mistake, it's a pattern of fraud. The room buzzed with energy, fear mixing with determination. For the first time, I wasn't alone. But Daniel must have sensed the shift. Because 2 days later, retaliation escalated again. Someone slashed Mariah's tires. James found his mailbox ripped off its post. And when I returned from work one evening, our shed, the very structure Daniel claimed as his, was splattered with red paint, the word thief dripping across the door. Laura gasped when she saw it. The kids cried. My chest burned with shame, even though I was the victim. That was Daniel's true weapon, not just lies on paper, but humiliation, pressure, fear. The police came, took photos, filed a report. But they warned me. Without witnesses, it's vandalism, hard to prove who did it. And Daniel, standing smugly in his yard as the officers left, mouthed across the fence, "You're finished." That night, I gathered the neighbors again. This isn't just my fight anymore. I told them, we need to stand together, file complaints, share evidence, force the city, the county, even the state licensing board to see what's happening here. Walter placed a trembling hand on my binder. I'll testify. I kept quiet once, but not again. The others nodded. For the first time, hope sparked. I spent hours scanning every document, sending packets to the city attorney, the state surveyor board, even local reporters. I didn't know who would listen first, but someone had to. Then, as midnight neared, I flipped back to the 2 versions of Exhibit C, the one with Thomas Brooks's name, and the cropped re-recording that erased him. A thought struck me cold. Only someone with access to the original records could have doctored the page, which meant this wasn't just Daniel's circle of allies. Someone deeper inside the system was helping them. My hands froze on the keyboard as realization hit. This wasn't only a family's fraud. It was a conspiracy, threaded through the HOA, the county filings, maybe even the city itself. And by digging, I had just placed a target squarely on my back. The clubhouse felt smaller than it ever had, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to hear our argument. Folding chairs scraped, phones hovered, whispers braided into a low, eager hum. Vanessa sat at the center of the head table like a judge without a robe, a gavel she didn't have thudding instead in her voice. Daniel stood to her right, sleeves rolled, smile practiced, a poster board version of the updated survey propped behind him like a campaign banner. Laura squeezed my hand once and found a seat beside Mariah. Walter slipped into the back row, brim of his faded ball cap low. I set my binders on the front table. The brick from my porch wasn't evidence, but I felt its weight anyway, the reminder that this meeting wasn't just about paper. Vanessa tapped the mic. We're here to finalize enforcement related to Lot 27's violations. Mr. Brooks, you may summarize. Daniel didn't read notes. He didn't need them. Neighbors, he began. I've tried to handle this quietly, but Mr. Harper has continued to encroach on my property, block access, and create drainage problems that affect all of us. This survey, he gestured to the poster, confirms the true boundary. The board has acted responsibly. He let the room absorb his certainty. Then he nodded to me with counterfeit grace. Your turn, Mike. I opened the first binder and slid certified copies to the edge of the table. Original recorded plat, Travis County, I said, voice steady. 6-foot utility and drainage easement behind our lots. It was never vacated. Here denied lot line adjustment from 8 years ago, for lack of owner consent. That owner was me, a murmur sharper this time. I flipped to the next tab, 2 versions of an attachment labeled Exhibit C. On the older image, the bottom margin reads, prepared by Thomas Ricci, Brooks, President, Cedar Ridge HOA 2000. On the re-recording added 2 months ago, that margin is cropped black. Same page, same text above the crop. The preparer's line gone. Vanessa kept her face neutral. Do you have the updated survey backing Exhibit C? The updated survey was stamped by a surveyor whose license expired last year. I said. State Board confirmed it this morning. That stirred the room. Daniel's jaw tightened, then smoothed again. Harper is cherry-picking. Recordings get corrected all the time. Scrivener's errors. Not to remove the name of the original preparer, I said. Not to erase who pushed the first clarification through. I lifted Walter's copies of the minutes. And 25 years ago, your father, President Brooks, forced a boundary adjustment in a closed session. The secretary kept notes. I didn't say Walter's name. I didn't have to. Several heads turned toward the back. Walter didn't move. Vanessa tapped the mic again. Harder. Speculation. If you believe there is fraud, Mr. Harper, your recourse is with the county or the courts. The HOA will not adjudicate criminal claims. Then stop pretending you can adjudicate my property, I said. A door opened along the side wall. A man in a city polo stormwater division stepped in with a clipboard and a roll of bright orange tape. He cleared his throat. Is Mr. Harper present? I raised my hand. Here. Inspection completed this afternoon, he said. Loud enough for the room. Rear drainage easement is obstructed by a fence segment, and recent tree removal has destabilized the slope. We're issuing a notice of violation and a stop work order regarding any additional fencing within that easement until corrective measures are approved. Gasps. A few phones angled toward Daniel. The inspector tore a sheet from his pad and handed it to me, then affixed an orange notice to the clubhouse corkboard for everyone to read. Questions can go to my office, he added, and left as simply as he'd arrived. Color rose along Daniel's neck. He forced a smile. A preliminary finding, he said quickly. We'll appeal. The city makes mistakes. Water doesn't, Mariah said from the second row. My basement doesn't. The spell cracked. Side conversations broke into open argument. Someone demanded to see my documents. Someone asked why Vanessa notarized anything for a dispute she was ruling on. Vanessa rapped the mic again. Voice clipped. Order. I gathered the room with a single sentence. I'm asking for 2 things tonight. Suspend enforcement against my family, and schedule an open hearing open to review the original plat, the easement, and the re-recorded packet. Let residents speak. Daniel laughed, the sound brittle. We don't negotiate with violators. Walter's chair scraped. His voice carried, thin but unshaking. You've been negotiating with violators for 25 years. Head swung. Vanessa reddened. Sir, you're out of order. No, Walter said, standing fully now. You are. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath. Then the clubhouse door opened again. Not the side door this time, but the front, and a courier in a gray blazer stepped in, scanning the crowd. Michael Harper, he called. I raised my hand, heart thudding. He came straight through the aisle and offered a heavy, sealed envelope. From the Travis County Clerk's office, certified true copies and an affidavit, per request. I took the packet. My hands were suddenly cold. The room pressed in, 50 people leaning without moving. I broke the seal and slid out a stack of clean, high-resolution image of the original Exhibit C page, no crop, no shadow. And below the preparer line, a second sheet affidavit of custodian of records. Irene Wallace, attesting under oath that the re-recorded image attached 2 months ago does not faithfully reproduce the bottom margin of the original page, and that the original bears the line, prepared by Thomas R. Brooks, President, Cedar Ridge HOA 2000. The final page was a log submitting party Brookline Property Services, LLC, Notary Vanessa Cole. My throat went dry. I looked up and found Daniel's eyes. The practiced smile was gone. I lifted the affidavit to the microphone so the letterhead filled the room, and before I could speak, Daniel lunged forward, palm slamming the mic off its stand. His face twisted with something I hadn't seen before panic. The courtroom carried a silence different from the clubhouse. No whispers, no folding chairs, just the heavy presence of law. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I set my binders on the plaintiff's table. Across the aisle sat Daniel, flanked by his wife Emily and Vanessa, their attorney whispering in clipped tones. The judge, a stern woman with rimless glasses, called us to order. We are here on the matter of Harper v. Brooks concerning boundary disputes, HOA enforcement, and alleged fraudulent recordings. Mr. Harper, you may proceed. I rose, palms damp, and began. Your Honor, for 15 years I lived beside Daniel Brooks as a friend. I never imagined I would be forced here. But the documents I present show a pattern: surveys altered, records re-recorded, and neighbors bullied into silence. This isn't about offense. It's about fraud embedded into the foundation of our community. I laid out the originals one by one, the certified plat with the drainage easement, the denied lot adjustment, the side-by-side Exhibit C pages, one with Thomas Brooks's name, the other cropped black. Then the affidavit from Irene, custodian of records. This sworn statement proves the re-recorded page does not match the county's original. Someone submitted a doctored version through Brookline Property Services, an LLC run by Daniel's wife, notarized by HOA board member Vanessa Cole. Gasps rustled through the gallery where neighbors had gathered. The judge leaned forward, studying the exhibits. Defense Daniel's attorney sprang up. Your Honor, these so-called discrepancies are clerical. Corrections happen. My client relied on a survey prepared in good faith with an expired license. I cut in, voice sharper than I intended. Confirmed by the state board. That's not good faith. That's malpractice. The judge's gaze shifted to the defense. Is this true? The attorney hesitated. The license lapse was technical. The survey remains valid. No, it doesn't, I said, sliding forward a letter from the registrar. The law is clear. Practicing without a license voids the work. Yet this board, led by Vanessa Cole, enforced fines and foreclosure threats against my family based on that void survey. The judge's gavel cracked once. Enough interruptions. Mr. Brooks, do you have any witnesses? Daniel stood, adjusting his tie, feigning composure. Yes, Your Honor, myself. He launched into a polished speech about community standards, about how I was difficult and combative, how the board had only sought to maintain order. He painted himself as the responsible neighbor, me as the reckless one. For a moment, I feared he might sway the room again. Then the back door opened. Walter stepped inside. His cane tapped against the floor as he approached the witness stand. Murmurs rippled. The judge raised an eyebrow. Identify yourself. My name is Walter Green. I was secretary of the Cedar Ridge HOA in 2000. I kept records. He opened a weathered folder and handed it to the bailiff. Inside were the original handwritten minutes, the same ones he'd given me in copies. In his shaky voice, he read aloud, President Brooks insisted the boundary behind lots 26 and 27 be redrawn. Owner consent absent. Adjustment forced through informal vote. Daniel's face drained of color. Walter continued, I stayed quiet for years, afraid of retaliation. But when I saw his son repeat the scheme falsifying surveys, fencing off easements, I couldn't stay silent. The judge's eyes sharpened. Are you stating under oath that the boundary was deliberately altered without proper consent? Yes, Your Honor, Walter said, and that it was done by Thomas Brooks, father of the defendant, with full knowledge it was unlawful. A collective gasp filled the room. Daniel half rose from his chair, his lawyer yanking him back down. Vanessa's hands gripped the table so tightly her knuckles whitened. I turned, locking eyes with Daniel. For the first time, he didn't smirk. He looked cornered. The judge leaned forward, voice low, but cutting. This testimony, combined with the exhibits, suggests not only civil liability but potential criminal fraud. I will be referring this matter to the district attorney's office. The room erupted, neighbors whispering, reporters scribbling, Daniel shouting protests as deputies stepped closer. And I knew the wall of lies was finally cracking. Chaos erupted as soon as the judge's words hit the air. Daniel shot to his feet, slamming his palms on the defense table so hard the wood rattled. "This is a witch hunt," he shouted, his voice cracking with something between rage and fear. Deputies moved forward, but the judge raised her hand for order. "Sit down, Mr. Brooks," she commanded. But Daniel wasn't listening. His carefully crafted mask, the smug calm he had paraded for weeks, cracked wide open. "You think you can smear my family's name with the lies of some bitter old man." He pointed directly at Walter, his finger trembling. "You're senile. You don't remember anything clearly." Walter didn't flinch. He simply met Daniel's glare with a steady gaze that carried 25 years of suppressed truth. "I remember enough to see you repeating your father's fraud," he said softly. The courtroom buzzed like a hive. Reporters scribbled furiously, neighbors whispered, and the judge hammered her gavel. Order. Daniel turned then, his fury swiveling toward me. "And you, Mike, don't think for 1 second you've won. You were nothing without me. I let you into this neighborhood, into this HOA. You think any of these people would have respected you without me?" His words spat like venom. I rose slowly, binder still in my hands. "I never needed your respect, Daniel. Just the truth." The judge's gavel came down again. "One more outburst, and I will hold you in contempt, Mr. Brooks." But Daniel was unraveling. "Contempt," he barked. "You want contempt. Look at this farce." He swept his arm toward the exhibits. Old papers, scribbles in the margins, a dead man's mistakes twisted into conspiracies. None of it matters. None of it. The attorney tried to pull him back into his seat, whispering frantically, but Daniel shoved him away. Vanessa shrank beside him, her face ashen. Emily stared at the table, silent, her composure finally slipping. Neighbors in the gallery exchanged looks, some wide-eyed, some vindicated. For months, they had seen me as the troublemaker. Now they saw Daniel for what he truly was: desperate, cornered, dangerous. The judge leaned forward, her voice like a blade. "Mr. Brooks, this is your last warning." But Daniel couldn't stop himself. His voice dropped into a hiss, audible even in the stunned silence. "If you keep pushing this, Mike, you'll regret it. I swear on my life, you'll regret it." Gasps rippled through the room. Deputies stepped in at once, each taking one of Daniel's arms. He thrashed, shouting curses at the system, at me, at anyone who would listen, his voice echoing down the marble halls as they dragged him from the courtroom. When the door slammed shut behind him, a heavy stillness settled. The judge exhaled slowly. "Proceedings will continue. Based on the testimony and documents provided, I am placing a temporary injunction on all HOA enforcement actions against Mr. Harper and ordering an independent audit of the Cedar Ridge HOA. Further, evidence of potential fraud will be forwarded to the district attorney for investigation." She tapped her gavel. Court adjourned. The sound reverberated through me like thunder. For the first time in months, the scales had shifted. I wasn't the one on trial anymore. Daniel was. As neighbors filed out, some avoided my gaze, but others, Mariah, James. Even strangers offered quiet nods, handshakes, murmured words like "about time" and "we're with you." Laura gripped my hand tight, tears in her eyes. "It's not over," she whispered, "but we're finally being heard." I looked at the binders on the table, the stack of certified copies, Walter steadying himself with his cane. For so long, I'd felt like one man shouting against a machine. Now the machine had stalled. Outside the courthouse, a news crew shoved a microphone toward me. "Mr. Harper, how does it feel to have turned the tables on your former best friend?" Before I could answer, a shout cut across the parking lot. Daniel's voice, hoarse and wild, carried from the back of a squad car. "This isn't finished." The verdict came 2 weeks later. By then, rumors had spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire. Some neighbors avoided eye contact, ashamed they'd once sided with Daniel. Others knocked on my door to quietly apologize, leaving casseroles or handshakes as tokens of solidarity. The HOA board, stripped of credibility, had gone silent. Even Vanessa stopped strutting down the sidewalks. Her blinds stayed drawn, her driveway empty. When Laura and I entered the courtroom that morning, the atmosphere was different from before. The gallery was packed with reporters, neighbors, even city officials. No one was whispering this time. They were waiting. The judge took her seat and wasted no time. Her voice rang clear. "In the matter of Harper v. Brooks, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff. Evidence demonstrates that fraudulent surveys and altered records were used to justify unlawful enforcement actions by the Cedar Ridge HOA." Gasps rippled through the room. I gripped Laura's hand so hard my knuckles whitened. The foreclosure threats, fines, and violations imposed on the Harper family are hereby null and void. The judge continued. Furthermore, the recorded Exhibit C resubmission is deemed invalid, and the original plat with the drainage easement shall remain the controlling document. Daniel sat stone-faced, flanked by his attorney, but his fury was palpable. Emily's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes downcast. Vanessa, summoned as a witness to her own notarization, looked ready to vanish through the floor. The judge wasn't finished. The court refers the matter of fraudulent filings and potential conspiracy to the district attorney's office for criminal review. Additionally, the Cedar Ridge HOA board is dissolved, pending a community election under independent oversight. The gavel cracked. The case was decided. For a moment, the world blurred, then cheers rose from the gallery, neighbors clapping, Mariah crying out. Finally, Walter, frail but proud, nodded at me from the back row. His decades of silence had ended in vindication. I turned to Laura. Tears streaked her cheeks, but her smile was unshakable. "We did it," she whispered. Daniel surged to his feet, his chair screeching backward. Deputies closed in instantly, ready in case of another outburst. His voice cracked like splintering wood. "This isn't over. You think you can erase the Brooks legacy with one ruling? I'll take this to appeal. I'll burn it all down before I let you win." The judge's gavel came down hard. "Remove him from my courtroom." As deputies dragged him toward the exit, his wild eyes locked on mine. "You'll regret this, Harper. I'll make sure of it." But this time, no one listened. No one believed. His words sounded less like threats and more like the desperate cries of a man who had lost everything. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Microphones crowded my face. Reporters fired questions about the fraud, the HOA collapse, the decades of manipulation. I answered as calmly as I could. This was never about revenge. It was about truth. My family was threatened, my home nearly stolen, but today proved that no one is above accountability, not even those who hide behind boards and bylaws. Laura slipped her hand into mine as we walked to the car, the weight of months of fear finally lifting. For the first time in a long time, the air felt lighter. Yet as we pulled out of the parking lot, I caught sight of Daniel through the tinted window of a police transport van. He wasn't shouting anymore. He was smiling thin, cold, and unbroken, and the sight sent a chill crawling down my spine. The days after the verdict felt like stepping into a different neighborhood. The orange violation tags vanished from my fence. The foreclosure threats stopped. For the first time in months, Laura and I could sit on our porch without scanning the street for Daniel's shadow. Word spread quickly that the HOA board had been dissolved. Notices went out for a new election under the city's supervision. Neighbors who had once muttered behind curtains now emerged into the sunlight, eager to reclaim their voices. The clubhouse, once Daniel's stage, became a gathering place for something better: transparency. At the first community meeting, there was no pomp, no lecturing, no threats. Instead, residents passed around copies of the original plat, the real plat, as if it were a sacred text finally rescued from fire. Mariah stood and told everyone how her yard had flooded since the easement was fenced. James described the mysterious fines that had piled up at his door. One by one, people admitted how they had been intimidated, how they had stayed silent out of fear. When my turn came, I didn't give a speech. I just held up Walter's yellowed notes, still trembling slightly in my hands, and said, "This was almost buried, but the truth doesn't rot. It waits. And when we protect each other, it rises again." The room broke into applause, not for me, but for themselves, for the relief of realizing they were not alone anymore. Afterward, Walter shuffled up, leaning on his cane. "Told you paper wins," he murmured with a half smile. "But it takes courage to lift it high enough for others to see." I clasped his shoulder. "We couldn't have done this without you." As the weeks passed, we rebuilt more than fences. The illegal barricade came down, restoring the shared pathway. The city ordered corrective grading where the oak had once stood, and neighbors planted new trees along the easement, this time together, as a gesture of unity. The red paint was scrubbed from my shed, replaced by fresh whiteboards where kids chalked drawings instead of slurs. One evening, Laura and I walked the block with our children. Laughter drifted from porches, barbecue smoke curled into the sky, and for the first time in so long, Cedar Ridge felt like a neighborhood again, not a battlefield. Still, shadows lingered. Daniel's house sat dark, its lawn overgrown, mail piling at the door. Rumor had it he and Emily had fled to her sister's place while legal investigations churned. Vanessa resigned her notary license, quietly moving out before the city's audit was complete. The Brooks legacy, once untouchable, now lay in pieces. But the fear wasn't entirely gone. Sometimes, at night, I'd catch Laura staring out the window, as if expecting headlights to pause outside our house. Sometimes I felt it too, the echo of Daniel's threats, the memory of that cold smile behind the van's tinted glass. And yet, in the light of day, we kept moving forward, because that's what survival meant: not forgetting the danger, but refusing to let it define us. At the next neighborhood gathering, just as we prepared to elect a new board, a courier strode in carrying a thick envelope addressed to me. He handed it over without a word. My heart pounded as I broke the seal and froze at the first line: deposition notice. Brooks v. Harper, appeal filed. The envelope sat on my desk for days before I opened it again. The words Brooks v. Harper screamed in bold at the top, but by then I had already learned not to fear paper. It was just another weapon Daniel tried to wield. And this time, it would cut him instead of me. The district attorney's office moved faster than anyone expected. With Walter's testimony, Irene's affidavit, and the state board's confirmation of an expired surveyor license, the fraud case turned criminal. Daniel's appeal was swallowed whole by the charges against him: filing false instruments, conspiracy to defraud, HOA misconduct. Vanessa and Emily were pulled into the dragnet too. Neighbors who once clung to silence now came forward in waves. They submitted statements, photos, emails, proof of intimidation, fines without basis, even cash donations Daniel had demanded to expedite approvals. What once seemed like whispers became a chorus, undeniable and deafening. The night the news broke on television, former HOA president and board members indicted for fraud, the entire street poured out of their houses. Some clapped, some hugged, some simply stood together under the streetlights, silent with relief. For the first time in years, Cedar Ridge wasn't divided. We were united, not by fear, but by the truth. Weeks later, I walked down the restored pathway behind our homes. Children zipped by on bikes, laughter ringing where only fences and threats had stood. The new oak saplings we planted stretched fragile branches toward the sky. They weren't strong yet, but they would grow, like us. Laura joined me, her hand warm in mine. "It feels different," she said softly. "It is different." I replied, "The lies don't own this place anymore." When the new HOA board was elected, it wasn't with backroom deals or intimidation. It was a fair vote. Ordinary neighbors, Mariah, James, even Walter as honorary advisor took seats. Their first act was to adopt transparency rules, open meetings, recorded minutes, independent audits. The rot that had poisoned Cedar Ridge for decades was gone, and as for me, I wasn't seeking power. I only wanted peace. I rebuilt the shed, replanted the roses, not as symbols of defiance, but as reminders that truth, like roots, always finds its way back to the surface. Daniel never returned to our street. Rumor had it he was negotiating a plea to avoid prison. Maybe he'd vanish into obscurity, maybe not. But one thing was certain: he could no longer bully, threaten, or steal from us again. On the night of our neighborhood's first true block party in years, I stood under the string lights watching my children laugh with their friends. For months, I'd feared we would lose everything. Instead, we gained something stronger than property lines. We gained trust. As the music drifted and neighbors raised their glasses, I felt the weight of the past finally slip from my shoulders. The fight was over. Justice had been served. And yet, as I looked around at the people I called neighbors, I couldn't help but wonder if a single fake map could nearly destroy families and a community. What invisible lines might still be lurking in our own lives, waiting for someone powerful enough to redraw them?